Let's now bring in former federal prosecutor Caleb Mason. Caleb, you know, when you have a client who videotaped a confession, what do you do?
Well, in this case, the defendant did make some significant statements. What you would look at if you were the defense trying for a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict is distinguish the admissions that were made in that statement from the relevant inquiry, which is what was his state of mind at the time of the commission of the murders. And the inquiry is, at the time that he pulled the trigger and killed Kyle and Littlefield, was he, because of a severe mental disease or defect, unable to perceive that the act was wrong? I think the only viable way that this could be argued on the facts of this case as we know them so far would be to argue that Routh had severe PTSD, combined perhaps with pre-existing schizophrenia, that led to a psychotic break or a dissociative state in which he perceived that he was factually not in Texas with two men who were trying to help him, but rather in a war zone, perhaps in Iraq, and that he was fighting enemy soldiers.
And let me pick up that point, Caleb. As our reporter, Charles Hadlock, mentioned, the widow did testify. We have some footage I want to show of her actually speaking on the cycle earlier, but responding to that idea that you just referenced, that PTSD could come into play here as a defense. Take a listen.
Chris and I were blessed enough to know a large number of men in many different justice-related fields, big-hearted men who experienced something traumatic, and many of them have PTSD. They don't go around talking about it. They don't use it as an excuse. They carry guns. They do good in the world. They love their families. They struggle with sleep or mood swings, just like a lot of people do with their internal struggles. But it doesn't change their character. It doesn't make you a murderer.
That was Ms. Kyle's response there in 2013. And also more broadly, speak to us about how her testimony might come into play in the minds of the jurors in this case.
I think with respect to the latter question, a juror in this case would see a horrific event that really should not have happened and happened to a person who was trying to help a troubled veteran. A juror might have a hard time applying the instructions that they will be given with respect to the insanity defense. But I would emphasize that it is irrelevant whether 80, 90, 99% of people who have PTSD do not commit violent acts. I'm sure that's true. But what is relevant is going to be, if these are the facts that are proved through medical testimony that the defense is likely to present, if the defendant had a mental disease, namely PTSD or schizophrenia or some combination thereof, that resulted in a dissociative state in which he did not realize what he was doing. In other words, that he did not realize that he was shooting his friends or benefactors, and he genuinely believed that he was shooting enemies on a battlefield. If that is the testimony that's presented by his doctors, then as a matter of law in Texas, he's not guilty. That does not mean he would be set free. He would be confined to a mental institution, and he would be confined to a mental institution for some time, presumably a long time, period of years, until he was deemed no longer a threat. But I would emphasize, if I were the defense, that while the vast majority of people who suffer from these conditions may not end up committing violent acts, for those that do, it is indeed a defense as a matter of law.
That's a very important point. Caleb Mason, a complicated case. Thank you so much for helping